but our lecture this evening is entitled From Jerusalem to Rome. And we are so happy to have back with us Brian Carwana of the Encounter World Religion Center, who will be giving tonight's lecture. Brian, wonderful to have you with us.
Thanks, John. Thanks to John and to Leandro for this invitation, and thank you all for being here. Yeah, I'm the executive director of Encounter World Religions, and I also have a blog at Religions Geek. If you feel like checking that out, I blog about religions all the time, and we run events, including a mix of in-person visits to houses of worship combined with classes called the Discovery Week every summer, and talks online and stuff like that. So if you're interested, you can check those out. Yeah, so for today, I want to talk to you about the shift in the early Jesus movement. How did this community that starts with this very Jewish guy and a bunch of Jewish followers, how does it end up as a movement of the Roman Empire? It starts as a Jewish movement and ends up Gentile. So how does that shift happen? And I'm characterizing it as the movement from Jerusalem to Rome. Okay, and so in order to explore that, our agenda is this follow. We'll explore the life of Jesus the Jew. Everybody knows he's Jewish, but I would also say that people miss just how Jewish he is. So I want to talk about that there. Then I want to talk about, okay, so what happened after Jesus's life, after he dies, after he's resurrected? His followers know that he's resurrected. What are they doing? What is the early Christian communities like, even before there's the word Christian? And so we will look at the very earliest kind of post-resurrection communities that we know of. And then we'll also consider how the movement is shaped by a series of successes and failures in proselytizing, that is, in evangelizing or trying to convert people. The movement has some both great wins and has some very notable losses that change the direction of the future movement. We'll also examine the central role of Paul. This movement from Jerusalem to Rome is certainly not due to any one person. But if you were going to say who is the most important person, I don't think there's anyone who would deny that Paul is the most central figure here. So we're going to talk about him. And finally, we'll end up with what is the legacy of this unusual relationship? It is an unusual relationship. The Christian scriptures actually contain many of the Jewish scriptures in them. That's not a common thing, right? That's quite unusual. So we'll look at the legacy of this unusual relationship. Okay, so let's start with Jesus. Who is this guy? Who is Jesus the Jew? All right, context. Jesus is born as a Jew and of course lives as one. And that means that he is inculcated in the Jewish scriptures from the time he's a young boy, taught monotheism, here's all the stories. He exists in an environment where everyone knows the stories of figures like Abraham and Moses, and that's how they draw examples from daily life, or say you should think of so and so, and it's the figures from those texts. And there is adherence to the Jewish law. Everyone around him does this. His parents do it, his neighbors, and he does too, as we'll show. And of course, he knows Jewish history. He knows some of the stories and folklore of the Jewish people. And another thing, besides the scriptures, is the temple. And I cannot overstate, when people think of Judaism today, they do think of scriptures, they think of rabbis, but they don't think of a temple. But in Jesus's day, the temple is kind of the beating heart of the religion. It is the sun upon which much revolves. It is the place where people go for animal sacrifice. The temple is a place of blood sacrifice. And this temple is going to come up several times in our conversation. Yahweh is at some level understood to live there, to reside in that temple. It is the center point of the faith. The Christian movement has nothing like this. The Vatican is not nearly the same sort of status. So there's this temple that dominates Jewish life and is something Jesus is well aware of. It's where you hopefully go for the large temple, the large festivals like Passover. He also grows up in a community that has messianic hopes. They're hoping for a Messiah, and that this Messiah will do things. He will restore the 12 tribes, that some of the tribes of Israel have been lost, and some believe the Messiah will somehow reconstitute them. And not only that, but he will restore political independence. They're under the thumb of the Romans, and nobody likes that. They want the Romans out of there. They want their own leadership like they used to have under David. The feeling is that the Messiah will kind of be the new David. He'll be of David's line. And so this is the context in which Jesus grows up. The first thing we encounter Jesus as an adult doing is he gets baptized by John. John is baptizing people and calling them to renewal and to repentance. The act of baptism is not central in Judaism, but there were the Essenes who did baptisms. And so John is, it's like something that it has some roots in the tradition. And the fact that Jesus is baptized by John is unusual. It seems to put Jesus in a subordinate role. And there will be in the early years rival communities of followers of Jesus and followers of John the Baptist. The followers of John the Baptist actually still exist. They're called the Mandeans. I've run into them twice in my life just by accident. Once at my chess club, and once at a little man-made lake where they were all baptizing. They get baptized over and over. In the Christian story, however, John speaks and says that Jesus is superior to him. That John is not worthy of tying Jesus's sandals. And so this is his start in a kind of a ritual that had some presence in the Jewish landscape. And when he emerges from this baptism, what does he do? He starts to call followers, and he calls fundamentally 12. I mean, he'll have other followers, but there are 12 with a kind of exalted status. And this is not lost on anyone in the Jewish landscape why he has 12. This, of course, refers to the lost tribes of Israel. Sorry, there's a typo there at the end. I don't know what that's doing there, but the lost tribes of Israel. The 12 apostles, I think, in a small way, helps us show how Jewish he is. Because in the Jewish landscape, that someone trying to restore Israel, someone who some would see as the Messiah, that he would have 12 apostles just makes complete and utter sense. From the long-term effect, the long-term look of Christianity, this doesn't seem so fundamental, right? Like if someone's converting to Christianity today in the Philippines or the Sudan or China, that Jesus would have 12 apostles and that this would tie to restoring Israel. In a Christian context, some sense has been made of it, but it doesn't feel, you could drop it probably, and the tradition would go on. But from a Jewish perspective, 12 just made absolute sense. And so I think this is one of the early indications of how Jewish this movement is. We can also see it. The other thing Jesus starts doing is he starts teaching and preaching. He is a teacher, a preacher. He's also a miracle worker, but I'm going to focus here on some of the teachings that he does. He is very much like a Pharisee, or we would later say a rabbi. I know the Pharisees, if you know Christian scriptures, the Pharisees are always given sort of a bum rap. But the Pharisees were actually quite popular. They were people who took the law very seriously, who knew their scriptures very well, and who were seen as quite devout. They were liked. And one of the things that the Pharisees did is they debate the law. They debate and debate and debate. And this is true to Judaism today. One of the most prominent Jewish texts is called the Talmud. The Talmud will take a passage of scripture and have rabbi after rabbi across the ages has written their interpretation. And the interpretations don't agree, they disagree. And it doesn't have a solution at the end. And that's what you do when you learn Jewish tradition, is you study the Talmud, you study the arguments, and you read it with somebody so that you kind of debate and dialogue with them. Debate, argument is central to Judaism. It is honestly part of the religious practice, as a number of Jewish scholars have pointed out. I bring this up because Jesus also enters into debates, and people often see this as him rejecting Judaism, but it is actually a very Jewish act. I've read a number of early Jewish scholars. I just want to highlight one who's particularly unusual. This is Amy Jill Levine. What is unique about Amy Jill Levine is that although she is a scholar of early Christianity and a scholar of the historical Jesus, she's a Jew. She's actually an Orthodox Jew, which means she's deeply steeped in Jewish tradition. And her writing is so interesting and has made such an impact in scholarship because she can point to you over and over how when Jesus makes this argument over here, it's very much like this rabbi's argument over here. or he's making this comparison from Jewish tradition. And she's helped a lot of people to realize just how deeply Jewish his arguments are. So when he's arguing with Pharisees, don't see that as him rejecting Judaism. That is what a good Jew who's into the law and has a view on the law, that's what they do. And you can see this in many ways in the speech of his that we have. So at one point, Jesus is asked, what is the most important commandment? And he says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." This is called the Shema because it starts in Hebrew with Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then he says the second commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. Both of these are drawn from Scripture. And in the text, when it's read in the Christian scriptures, sometimes it's just framed like everyone is astonished at what Jesus is saying. But I have to tell you, these are like textbook answers for good observant Jews. What's the most important commandment? What's the most important statement in Judaism? It's this one: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Every Jew, who goes to Saturday school, if I can use the term, knows this. So when Jesus answers, he's answering exactly like a good observant Jew should. In the same way, Jesus another time utters the golden rule. In everything, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And then he says something in addition. He says, "For this is the law and the prophets." And this also meets with approval. And it makes sense that it meets with approval because, again, Jews know where he's drawing this from. A few decades before Jesus, there were two great thinkers in the Jewish landscape. There was the school of Hillel, who followed Hillel, and the school of Shammai, followed Shammai. And there's a famous story, Jews all know this story, that a Gentile comes up to Shammai and says to Shammai, "I'll convert to Judaism if you can explain to me what the Torah is about, if you can explain to me Jewish law while I'm hopping on one foot." And Shammai picks up a piece of wood and hits him on the side of the head and says, "Go away." And then the guy goes to Hillel and says, same thing, "I'll convert, I'll become a Jew if you can explain to me, teach me the Torah while I stand on one foot." And Hillel famously answers, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." And then he says another thing, "That is the whole Torah, go and learn it." So this is the golden rule, right? Now here it is phrased a bit differently. Jesus has taken what is a negative phrasing, "Don't do what is hateful," to something positive. So he has played with it. He's innovated with it. And then Jesus said, "This is the law and the prophets." The word law is a synonym for the word Torah. So I say that just to say that Jesus is responding like a good Jew. He's drawing on Hillel. People who hear this know it's Hillel, and they're going to say, yes, that's right. Okay, so it just helps us situate and help us understand the context from which he's coming from. He, of course, does at times argue, again, which is part of the tradition, and he has great stories, right? He's a particularly good storyteller. The Good Samaritan is a story that people who have no knowledge of Christianity can appreciate this story. And it is one of his key themes. He does fight with religious authorities of his day at times, but what he fights over is an ethical issue. He fights over hypocrisy. That's what this story is about, right? The man is beaten and left to die, and the religious leaders come along and they cross over to the other side, and the Samaritan helps him. And Jesus does constantly criticize hypocrisy, but again, all of this is in the realm of Jewish teaching. In short, what I wanted to suggest to you or point out to you is that Jesus really argues about how to interpret Jewish law, not whether to follow it. There is no examples of him saying, these laws, just forget about them, right? He never does that. What he does is he argues the way they're being interpreted, that they're being interpreted by the letter of the law and not the spirit, that they're being interpreted without the compassion and mercy of God, things like that. There is something else about him that is also very Jewish, and this is a little harder to read, these next couple examples. Almost with every religious figure that we have information on, sometimes there are little passages amidst often much beauty. Sometimes there's a couple passages that are a bit hard to read. And so here are two that I highlight because they also reflect, quite frankly, what the views of many Jews would have been, 2,000 years ago. And so they both deal with Jesus dealing with a Gentile, with somebody who is not a Jew. And the first is the woman at the well. She's a Samaritan. The Samaritans are like rivals to Jews. They say that they have the true Torah, that they worship at the true temple, that they're the true followers of God, and that the Jews have gone astray, and the Jews say the opposite. And so the Samaritan, the woman, says to him, our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem. We worshipped here, Jews worship there. And Jesus responds, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. Modern Christians will focus on that last 5 words as saying that Jesus is the Messiah. But in context, this is a claim about who has truth, Jews or Samaritans. And Jesus answers, of course, we Jews do, and you Samaritans don't. There's a second example of this. This involves the Canaanite woman. This Canaanite woman comes and she starts shouting, have mercy on me, Lord, son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon. And she's a Canaanite. She's not a Jew. And the people around Jesus want her to go away. And he doesn't answer her at all. And his disciples are irritated, and they came and urged him, saying, send her away. And finally he answers her, and he answers, I am sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Okay, so she's coming, her daughter's tormented, she's begging him, and he's saying, I'm not for you, I'm for the Jews. But she continues, she's persistent. She comes and kneels before him, saying, Lord, help me. And he answers, it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Now, can you see who the children are here and who are the dogs? He's coming for the lost house of Israel. The Jews are the children, right? And she, the non-Jew, is clearly the dogs. That's how everyone in this audience understands this. And she says, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. And so Jesus answered her, woman, great is your faith. Let it be done as you wish. Right? And her daughter was healed instantly. This is in Matthew. Now, again, today, this story, what people focus on is that her faith healed her and his power. But that interaction, reflects a tribalism, essentially, that's common, honestly, in human history and would have been common to many Jews of that day. Okay, so in looking at Jesus's teachings and his words, what do we see? We see that he debates Jewish law, just as a good Jewish preacher should, that he cites Jewish teachings like the Shema. He cites the appropriate Jewish authorities like Hallel. He's drawing from the store of what Jews draw from. He critiques hypocrisy. He uses powerful parables. And we even get a couple instances where he seems to speak in ways that diminish Gentiles, that make them kind of secondary. Now, those are his words. Let's move on to the other aspect, because we are not just what we say, we are what we do. And here too, I think you will find that his actions just demonstrate how profoundly Jewish he is. So first, what's one of the most, routine things we do? We eat. And Jesus eats according to Jewish law. There are no examples of him breaking this law, of there being a great big uproar or great big debates about him violating Jewish law. If he did, we would know about it. It would have been a big deal. There would have been accusations hurled at him. His apostles would have asked him about it. So it's widely understood he eats according to Jewish law. I do want to put a little asterisk here. There is one little claim, a little claim in one little passage in some brackets that he gets rid of it. And I'm going to revisit this earlier. So I'm putting the asterisk there, but as you'll see when we revisit earlier, I'm quite comfortable. And every scholar I've ever read says, yeah, he follows Jewish dietary laws, right? So Jewish dietary laws are no pork, and you can't eat shellfish, and you can't eat, you have to drain the meat of blood and things like this. So he's following dietary laws at every meal. Second, he dresses according to Jewish law. How do we know that? Well, the texts tell us. Jews today wear what are called tzitziot, that is fringes. You can see them here. Today they're worn on a garment worn under the shirt, and then they hang down like this. But in Jesus's day, they were attached to the end of your cloak. Every Jewish man had to wear them. Why? Because God tells you to. In the Torah, he says to affix these fringes to the end of your cloak. Why? Because God says you will see them. And when you see them and follow my commandment by having them there, it will remind you to follow the other commandments. So it's a commandment that reminds you to follow the other commandments. And Jesus, every Jewish male in his day wore these, and so did he. And we know because we can read about it. He is walking in a crowd one day, and this woman comes up behind him and touched the fringe of his clothes, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she was healed. And Jesus stops and says, "Who touched me?" And his apostles are a little confused, or his disciples are confused because he's in a crowd and lots of people touched him. He says, "No, who touched me?" And he finds the woman and says, "Your faith is healed." She touched the fringe of his clothes. There's another time where he is criticizing the Pharisees for hypocrisy, because he says that they're doing a lot of their religious deeds in a showy way. They're doing it to be recognized. And as I mentioned to you, hypocrisy is a big sort of sticking point with him. And so he says of the Pharisees, they do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. I'll visit the phylacteries in a moment. They make their fringes long, right? So what's he saying? Is he saying you shouldn't have fringes? No, he's saying it shouldn't be showy, right? And they make their phylacteries broad. They make them big and showy. What are the phylacteries? The phylacteries are these. This is called tefillin. They're two black boxes. And again, Jewish males in Jesus's day and to this day wear them at prayer time. You tie one around your left arm. There's a little box there that has a scripture. And you tie one around your forehead, and there's a scripture. Why do you do this? Because God tells you to. God says, bind these words upon your arm. There it is. And affix them as frontlets between your eyes. And so the whole passage is written on that, and it's put there. And Jesus criticizes the Pharisees. He doesn't say this is silly. We're not going to do this anymore. No, what he says is they do it. They make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. And of course, the implication is that you should do it in a humble way. But presumably, you should do it. And again, if he did not do this, there would be we should see that in the text. That would have been a big deal. So now we know he eats according to Jewish law. He dresses according to Jewish law. And these are worn at prayer time. You pray multiple times a day. And so we know, too, he is praying according to Jewish law. He's strapping on the phylacteries, and you do a kind of liturgical prayer with bowing. You recite set words every day. It's a kind of liturgy. Okay, so all of those things are unsurprising. That is just what Jewish males in his day did. And we have evidence of him doing these things. And we have no evidence of him ever saying to stop do these things. And finally, he honors and prays at the temple. This is the temple. When we think of religious buildings today, we think of them as places of prayer. But that's not primarily what a temple was in Jesus's day. The key thing about the temple is what is out here. And that is an altar where you make blood sacrifices. Every day you kill an animal, the priests kill an animal, and they burn it, and they offer it as a sacrifice to God. God asks them to do this. He tells them how to do it, what words to recite, how the organs of the animal are to be dispensed with, and it all makes a pleasing odor to God. Today in our planet, we have almost no animal sacrifice for religious uses. There are some, but compared to historically, like a fraction. This was just very common. And it's a central ritual. You connect with people by offering them food. You invite a girl out for a date. You invite your neighbor over for coffee. That's how you bond with people, right? If you want to take the relationship to a different level. And ancient peoples did this too. And how do you bond with God? You offer them food. And how do you offer them food? In some places, they put food up to the mouths of temples. But they're of statues, excuse me. But the other thing that was done in many, many places of the world is you burned it because fire consumes it. And what does it do? It sends it up in smoke up to the gods. And so that's what the temple is, a place of fire sacrifice, of high ritual purity. There's a place where only the high priest can be, a place where the other priests can be, a place where Jewish males can be, a place where Jewish females can be, a place where Gentiles who are male can be, and then a place where female Gentiles can be. So a very sort of structured, hierarchical fire sacrifice kind of place, right? I'm just emphasizing all these things because they are different than how we think of religion today, but they're common then. And Jesus is comfortable with this temple. At one point, he says to people, if you're going to offer your gift at the altar, that means maybe you're bringing a bird to be sacrificed, a pigeon or something. You have a bitterness with your brother. He says, leave your gift at the altar and go thy way. First go and be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift. Right? So he's not saying this is a waste of time or anything like that. But what he's saying is, don't go there with anger in your heart, right? There's a high ethics to him. He defends the temple. I mean, essentially he ends up dying because he has this ruckus at the temple at Passover. I'll talk more about that later. And when he defends it, he says famously, you have made of my father's house a den of thieves. For Jews, Yahweh at some point was understood to reside within the temple. So again, very consistent with Jews of his day. And much of his life is connected to the temple, as it is for many Jews. When he's 8 days old, they take him to the temple, and Simeon holds him and says, mine eyes have seen thy salvation. When he's 12, they go to the temple for Passover, because that's what Jews do. He talks about making the sacrifices at the temple, like I just told you, reconcile with your brother first. And then he goes for Passover in the days that will lead to his death as well, and says, this is my father's house. Because again, God is understood to reside there. Okay, so his actions too are just profoundly Jewish. The way he eats, the way he dresses, the way he prays, and his deep connection to the temple, a place of animal sacrifice that all Jews understood as the central place of connecting to God. Okay, so in both his words and his actions, he is profoundly Jewish. So that's Jesus. Jesus' life comes to an end, and then his followers understand that he has resurrected. So what is the movement like after the resurrection? And so the earliest window we have into a Christian community is described in the book of Acts, when it says here, day by day, as the followers of Jesus, the leaders, as they spent much time together, where? In the temple. They broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts. Right? So this is after Jesus has died, but they're still going day by day to the temple. And I'm saying that because if you go to the temple, that means you are still see yourself as a Jew. You're still going for the sacrifices. You're still taking part in the rituals. We know this because there's a little more description further on. One day, Peter and John were going up to the temple at the hour of prayer at 3:00 in the afternoon. The hour of prayer is the hour where you sacrifice the animal, right? So they understand that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is resurrected, but they didn't say, forget all this Jewish stuff. They're Jews. They're going to the temple. If they're going at the hour of prayer, they're wearing the phylactery still. They still have the fringes on the end of their garments. They're almost surely following the dietary laws, and we will find out indeed that they are. Okay, I just want to point out that today, Christianity has left so much of this behind, but the people who knew him, Peter is his right-hand man, John is his left-hand man. Even after he's died and resurrected, they have no notion that they are supposed to stop being Jews. He was a Jew. He lived like this. They ate with him. They prayed with him. They followed kosher dietary laws with him. He's a Jewish Messiah. They have a Jewish movement. Okay, and the two biggest leaders in the movement are James, Jesus's brother, and Peter, as I say, his right-hand man. Okay, and they're around the temple. Both of them live in Jerusalem. Okay, however, something is going to change, and the movement is going to start to alter. So we've described what it was like, immediately after his death, that the leaders are still around the temple. But the movement is going to start to change because there is going to be some real successes and some real failures in trying to proselytize or spread the message. Proselytizing in Israel fails. It fails quite miserably. Jesus as a Messiah is a message that never really convinces the Jews of Israel. It barely gets anybody at all. Jews understood that the Messiah was going to overthrow the Romans, that he would inherit David's throne. And instead, there are these people saying it's Jesus, and that guy died naked on a tree. He was hung as a criminal by the Romans, and we're not free of anything, and we haven't got our kingship back, right? There will be efforts by the early Jesus followers to convince people that Jesus actually is the Messiah. And so part of what they do is they look at the prophecies and try to show how Jesus fulfilled these. And we can see this in the Gospels when they are eventually written. One of the prophecies was that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. Bethlehem, you can see, is down here in the south near Jerusalem. But the problem is that Jesus was known as Jesus of Nazareth. Nazareth is up here in the north, near the Sea of Galilee. And so what happens eventually is that as stories are written of Jesus's birth, they will get Jesus of Nazareth to be born in Bethlehem. There are two birth stories. The earliest accounts of Jesus don't have a birth story. The first writings we have about Jesus are Paul. We're going to talk a lot about Paul. Paul never describes Jesus's biography. He does mention the birth a couple of times, but he mentions it in a way that dismisses it. He says Jesus was born of the flesh, born under the law. He doesn't say he was, had this miraculous birth or anything like that. Nothing about Jesus's birth seems of interest to Paul. And then in particular, the first gospel written is the Gospel of Mark, and Mark starts with Jesus being baptized. So he gives a biography, but finds nothing worthwhile about Jesus's birth to be written. However, the next two accounts that are written are Luke and Matthew, and they both will write stories. They both write virgin birth stories, but they both will try to show how Jesus fulfills prophecy. They pursue different paths. So let's start with Luke. Luke is famously known as the social gospel. It just means that if your view of Jesus is that Jesus is here for the poor and the marginalized, there is no place you will find that more than in Luke's gospel. In Luke's gospel, the first thing the adult Jesus does after the baptism is he walks into a synagogue and picks up a scroll and says, I have come to proclaim, he reads a passage from Isaiah, I've come to proclaim release to the captives, to give sight to the blind, to help the captive, to help the lame, the poor, etc. And Jesus at the end rolls it up and says, this has been fulfilled in your presence. First thing he does in Luke is to announce that's what he's here for. And it pervades his gospel. That story of the Good Samaritan, which is a story about looking after the needy, only in Luke. A lot of people's favorite parables are just in Luke. So Luke wants to emphasize that Jesus is here for the marginalized. Now, he also wants to show that Jesus fulfills prophecy. But Jesus of Nazareth needs to be born in Bethlehem. And so what happens in Luke's gospel is that the family lives in Nazareth. They only go to Bethlehem because a horrible ruler, that Caesar in Rome, orders a census, and the census forces them to Bethlehem. Scholars don't buy this part of the story because there is no known census. One person pointed out, he said, we don't know of a census anywhere in human history where people had to leave the town where they were and go to the town they were born in for a census. If there's a census today in Canada or the United States, you don't have to go where you're born. You just do it where you are. And if you did have to go where you were born, it'd take a lot of time and waste a lot of energy. And you have cars and planes. In the Roman Empire, it would take weeks and months. And no one writing in Rome has ever commented about this. There's no one knows of this kind of bizarre disruption in daily life. It's not anywhere except in this one passage in Luke. But what the census does is it forces them to Bethlehem. And the census is ordered by the Roman Caesar, who everybody hates. And people hate a census because it's the way that the government figures out how many young men there are to pull them into the army. and how much money you have to tax you. But according to the story, they're forced to go to Bethlehem. There's no room at the inn, and so they have to give birth in a kind of barn. And today, our images of this birth scene are very enticing. There's a lot of warm, soft light. The animals look very docile. It looks like you're going to go and just snuggle in there. But scholars think that this was not the intent. This is a kind of modern, we're urban people. A lot of us don't live near barns, and barns now are like a field trip. But for these folks, they had to give birth in a dirty, unhygienic, stinking barn because of that horrible Caesar who forced the census, right? And so there's a contrast that Luke is drawing between this baby who's born humbly and the terrible guy in Rome, right? And so in this story, this is what happens. And so the family lived in Nazareth. They come to Bethlehem because they're forced to by the census. And as soon as this is over, after the birth, within a few days, they head back to Nazareth. They go to Jerusalem and present him at the temple. I showed you that already when he's still a baby. And then they return to Nazareth. Okay, so you live in Nazareth, you come to Bethlehem, give birth, and you just go right back. That's Luke. Matthew is quite different. Matthew's gospel is often seen as the gospel written to the Jews, to try and convince Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, to convince Jews that Jesus is the Messiah, Matthew does not want a humble birth because he already has the problem. The Jewish Messiah is supposed to be a big guy, and instead, Jesus, died as a criminal on a tree. And so he wants to say to Jews, no, this guy's actually really big and really important. And so the manger scene is not there. He doesn't show Jesus being born in humble ways. Instead, there's something that announces that this is a grand birth, and that is a star. The star is not in Luke's gospel at all. There's a star in the heavens. And who comes to this birth? In Luke's, the only people who come are poor shepherds, because Luke's social gospel, Jesus is for the poor. But in this one, Jesus is someone big. And so who comes to the birth? Wise men from the east, bearing gifts fit for a king, right? Matthew wants Jews to see this and go, oh, gold, frankincense, myrrh, foreign dignitaries coming, right? And in this story, it appears that they live in Bethlehem because these wise men seem to arrive months after the birth, and they don't go to Nazareth, they go to Bethlehem. And it says they enter the house and find the baby. You remember in Luke, they never lived in a house, right? And then what happens is Herod learns of this baby, and he wants to kill him. He doesn't know where the baby is. So he decides, according to Matthew's story, to kill all the children in the southern province that Herod rules, the province of Judea, where Bethlehem was and where Jerusalem is. And so there's this slaughter of babies. Now, again, scholars are skeptical that this event occurred. Slaughtering every baby in a province is a big deal. You would have uproars and civil wars, and there's nothing mentioned of it. It's not in Jewish histories that are written this century. This isn't part of the Jewish story. No Jew. The Jewish people don't have this story, even though supposedly all the infants were killed. But if you're Matthew and you're writing for a Jewish audience, if you're a Jewish audience, Jews have heard this story before. Do you know where they've heard this story before? Of all the Jewish babies being killed, except one that is singled out by God. This is the story of Moses. Right? Moses is saved by, they put him in the little basket of reeds and send him down the river. Every Jew knows that story. And so Matthew is saying this baby is just like Moses. And Moses is the most important person on the Jewish scene. This is Matthew again, elevating Jesus. And so Jesus's father, Joseph, is warned in a dream that this is going to happen. And he leaves and he flees. And where does he flee? He flees to Egypt, just of course is where Moses had the Jews in exile. And they lived there, it says, for years. Now, I'm not sure if you're following all this. In Luke's, they were in Nazareth. They just came to Bethlehem for the birth and went back home. But here, they're in Bethlehem. They live there. They only leave because they're forced away. And when they're forced away, they don't go to a home in Nazareth. They go to Egypt. It says they're there for years. And then years later, Herod dies. And Joseph is going to go back to Judea, that southern province. But he's warned in a dream not to. And then in Matthew's gospel, it says and he made his home in a town called Nazareth. It's only now, years later, that they end up in the north. Okay, so in Luke, the family lives in Nazareth. They're forced to Bethlehem for the birth, just briefly by a census. In Matthew, they seem to have a family home in Bethlehem, and they're forced from Bethlehem by Herod and only go to Nazareth years later. Right? They're both trying to show how Jesus fulfills these prophecies. They do it in other ways too. It was said that the Messiah would be a descendant of David, and so Luke creates an ancestry from David to Joseph. Joseph is Jesus's dad. That is hard to do. David lived 1,000 years earlier, and today, with all of our record keeping, and you can go to ancestry.ca, and records are digitized, and there's governments that keep records, probably none of you can trace your ancestry back 1,000 years. But that's what Luke writes. And Matthew does the same thing. He also writes it because he also needs to show Jesus is the Messiah and a descendant of David. But he ends up having completely different names in between. They don't even seem to agree how many centuries had passed, because where Luke has 42 generations, Matthew has 28. Okay, you can see here that they are trying to show that he fulfills the scriptures, but Jews don't find the Christian claims convincing. And finally, let me show you Matthew. The others do this too, but no one does it as much as Matthew. Matthew tries to show Jews that Jesus fulfills prophecy. And so when the family in Matthew's gospel is forced to Egypt, and they live there for years, and then eventually they leave and they make their home in a town called Nazareth, this is how it's described. Matthew says, "This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt I have called my son." So this is a quoting of scripture. But here's the actual scripture. It's in the book of Hosea, and it says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols." Okay, so for Jews, this is history, not prophecy. For Christians, it's prophecy. But Jews say, no, the child is Israel, and the child is a wayward child who keeps worshiping the wrong gods, right? So different takes on this story. Here's the second one, the murder of the innocents. I'm just using the birth stories that we just described, but it's throughout Matthew's gospel. You remember when the children are killed? In Matthew's gospels, it says, when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. That fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing in loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they were no more. Okay, that's in Matthew. And he says, look, this is to fulfill the prophecy. This is from Jeremiah. And sure enough, it's there. A cry is heard in Ramah, wailing, bitter weeping. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted for her children who are gone. But then it says right after that, restrain your voice from weeping, your eyes from shedding tears, for there is a reward for your labor, declares the Lord. They shall return from the enemy's land, and there's hope for your future, declares the Lord. Your children shall return to their country. Okay, so Matthew is saying prophecy, and Christians accept today that it is prophecy, but Jews look at that and say, no, that's a total... They're not merely saying that Jesus doesn't fulfill the prophecy. They're actually saying these aren't prophecies, they're history. And there's one last one I want to show you because it's a famous one. Matthew talks about the virgin birth, and he says, all this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel. Usually the quote, the counter argument is that Matthew is taking stuff out of context, but usually the quote is exact, but here it's not. The actual quote from Isaiah is this: look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. So he's changed a key term here. The overall passage is like this. Isaiah is calming the Jewish king Ahaz, who's stressed because there are two big empires neighboring them, and he feels like they're going to be destroyed. And Isaiah says, look, the Lord himself will give you a sign, Ahaz. There's a young woman who's with child, and she'll bear a son, and she'll name him Emmanuel. He'll eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to determine evil and from good, to choose evil from the good, the land whose two kings you are in dread of will be deserted. He says, don't worry, there's a young woman with child, and before that child is old enough to know good from evil, these two kingdoms will be gone. Don't worry, right? And so Matthew says this is prophecy, but many of his listeners, especially learned Jews, are going to say, this is history, and no, your story is wrong. Okay, so the proselytizing within Israel just fails. It just never takes off. However, the proselytizing beyond Israel succeeds, and succeeds mightily. And while it starts to succeed without Paul, there is no figure as important to this story as Paul. Paul was originally Saul, and he was a Pharisee. He was a Jew. He, by his own words, says that he rigorously upheld Jewish law, and he seems to have been pretty passionate about it because he was so passionate about it that he persecuted and killed some followers of Jesus who were dropping Jewish law. It's believed that he didn't kill the sorts of folks who were with Peter and James, who were going to temple and obeying Jewish law, but that there were some Jesus followers who were ditching the temple and ditching the law, and that he saw that as a kind of blasphemy and killed them. And then what happens is he has a conversion experience. Famously, this is depicted as the road to Damascus, blinding light knocking him off of his horse. In Paul's own letter, he doesn't describe that, but he does say that he had a kind of conversion, that Jesus had appeared to him. And it changes his life, and it even changes his name. Saul becomes Paul. After conversion, Paul becomes not just a Christian, but he becomes one of the most prominent. Usually most people consider him the most important person in the entire Christian story after Jesus himself. He becomes a very prominent leader. And importantly, he feels no fealty, no subservience to the other leaders of the church and to those who were leaders before him. And secondly, and just as critically, he makes the life-altering, perhaps world-altering choice to proselytize not to Jews in Israel, but to proselytize in the Gentile world. And that world is more receptive to this message. And there Paul will meet a kind of success that he probably never experiences if he stays in Israel. And this spreading outside of Israel was going on in many places, but the ones we know of most famously are where Paul wrote letters to Rome, to Thessalonica, Corinth, Philippi, Ephesus, and on and on. It was also in Alexandria and Antioch and places like that. And so what you get is a lot of the community is expanding amongst Gentiles, but not amongst Jews. And these Gentiles like Jesus, but they're not Jews. They don't follow Jewish law. And so the big early debate becomes the first kind of real question for the early Jesus movement, the Christian community, is how Jewish do you have to be? On one side of this argument will be Paul, and on the other is Jesus's brother James, who is the leader of the church, and Jesus's right-hand man, Peter. And the key issues are the dietary laws. Do you have to follow Jewish dietary laws that I mentioned earlier? And you have to circumcise, because Jews are supposed to circumcise in order to be children of Abraham. And this issue is brought to a head when they call Paul to Jerusalem in what is today called the Council of Jerusalem to settle this issue. And Paul goes there, and as he's going there, he writes in the book of Galatians, I am an apostle not from men, right? He wasn't called by them. He's saying I'm not subservient to them. The gospel preached to me is not man's gospel. It's not for debate, nor was I taught it. I did not confer with any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me. And you see how strongly he means this. Before God, I do not lie. And then he says, and from those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders, what they actually were makes no difference to me. Those leaders contributed nothing to me, right? That is very clear that he's saying, I take no orders from them, right? You can feel the tension. Later in this same letter, he writes about Peter. Peter here is called Cephas. It's another name for Peter, or Cephas, I think, sorry. When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, Peter, because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, Jesus's brother, he used to eat with the Gentiles, right? So what Paul is saying here is that Peter is breaking dietary laws and eating with the Gentile Christians. But after these people from James came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of what Paul calls the circumcision faction, the people who want to hold to Jewish law. And the other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas, a friend of Paul's, was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? Right? Paul is calling him out here. You can again feel the tension. And Paul not only calls out someone as big as Peter, he calls him a hypocrite and he writes it down. Right? So there's a clear tension. But what happens at this council is Paul wins the day. Peter and James agree that Gentiles do not have to be circumcised. And he says, instead, they say, write to them only to abstain from things polluted by idols, from fornication, and whatever has been strangled in from blood. And in turn, Paul will send them money because they are poor. They have a small, struggling church, and his are growing. And that's what happens, is eventually these groups grow and grow and grow. Paul's shaping of them defines that more Christians have connection with Paul than they do with James and Peter. The Jerusalem community is tiny. It does have something, though. It has James and Peter. It is the two most important people in the church. Until in the 1960s. In the 60s, Nero starts to kill a bunch of Christians, and Nero has both James and Peter killed. And shortly after that, there is a revolt in Jerusalem, and the temple is crushed. And the Jerusalem community that was tiny has lost its status figures. And when Jerusalem is crushed, their numbers are dwindled further. And soon what you get is this. You get a church that just, a few decades earlier was a movement that was completely made up of Jews, is now a movement that is almost completely made up of Gentiles in just a few decades. Paul is so fascinating. He is such a key source for what we know about Christianity and a key source for theology. He is the most written person in Christian scriptures. No one contributes more writing. He writes 7 to 9 letters. There are actually 13 in his name, but most scholars think these are authentic. The other 4 to 6 that are written under his name are surely written by people who are sympathetic to Paul and share his view. The writer of the book of Acts and the Gospel of Luke is one person, and that person is understood to be an associate of Paul. And later theologians will draw from him. As I say, no one writes as many words in what is today the Christian scriptures as Paul. He has such enormous influence, really more than James, more than Peter. And yet, he never met Jesus. He never ate with him following Jewish dietary laws. He never prayed with him with the tefillin and the phylacteries. And yet he is the one who wins this debate. Really interestingly, after Paul and Peter and James die, later writers will try to eliminate the tension between them and pull everyone into Paul's bracket. I'll show you how they do that. Mark gives one try at this. Mark writes just a few years after these people have died. And Mark has this passage where the Pharisees are criticizing Jesus. They say, your disciples are eating a meal without washing their hands. And according to Jewish tradition, you have to cleanse yourself before you eat a meal. And Jesus says, there is nothing outside a man which by going into him can defile him, but the things which come out of a man are what defile him. Whatever goes into a man from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and so passes on. And then Mark adds in brackets, thus he declared all foods clean. This is Mark trying to say that Jesus says, you can eat pork, forget all the dietary laws. This is very unconvincing, though. Matthew, who copies this exact passage, drops the brackets. And really, most scholars don't buy this for several grounds. One, what the Pharisees were asking about was washing hands, about ritual cleanliness, not about whether you can eat pork or not. So Jesus doesn't say that. Mark adds it in brackets. Second, Matthew, who has this same passage, deletes this. Third, It does not appear that anyone is aware of this. Later, when Paul and Peter and all of them are arguing about whether to eat food, if Mark was right, if Jesus had said you can eat whatever you want, then that whole argument makes no sense. Peter wouldn't need to be told this, and Paul wouldn't need to fight for it, right? But Mark here is trying to smooth it out because these figures are dead now and he wants them on the same page. Luke does the same thing. Luke too tries to smooth it out, but does a different story. He's not, Luke also copies a lot of Mark's gospel, but he doesn't take that passage. But instead, what he says, the second part of Luke's writings, or the book of Acts, and there Luke says that Peter, after the resurrection, has a dream one day. In the dream, some angels appear and they offer him all the forbidden foods, showing him that from now on the dietary laws are gone. We have no, this story is not anything that we get from Paul's letters. We don't find that he said, oh, Peter had this vision and now we're all on the same page. But Luke is writing this when Paul and Peter and Peter and James are all dead, and the story brings Peter into harmony with the vision that now dominates Christianity when Luke's writing this, because by this time the Jewish community is already dwindled and the movement is a Gentile movement. Okay, so this is the influence of Paul. With him, we see the movement go from a Jewish movement to a Gentile one. The movement that I've been describing is exacerbated. It's already underway, but it's exacerbated by two crises that I've already mentioned. One crisis will affect the Jews and one will affect the Christians. The crisis of the Jews is that they revolt against the Romans, and the Romans come to war and the Romans win, and they destroy the temple. They destroy the very heart of Judaism, the house where God lives. That temple had been destroyed before, 5 centuries earlier. And when the first temple was destroyed, Jewish leaders trying to figure out how to be loyal to God wrote the Torah. And in it, they said, we will be loyal without a temple by wearing phylacteries, by having fringes attached to our cloak, by following these dietary laws. And they had all these rules. And you could follow all these rules all day and show loyalty without priests burning something at an altar. So now with the second temple destroyed, Jews again turn to Torah. We will rigorously follow the Torah. And so in this crisis, and it is a complete crisis, they lose their high priest, they lose the temple, they lose everything. The only thing that maintains them is fidelity to the law. We will maintain being Jewish, not by making blood sacrifices, but by following the law. Well, as you can tell, that conflicts directly with Paul's vision that Christians can dismiss Jewish laws. Right? And so this really exacerbates. There are some Jews saying without the temple, all we have is following our laws. But this other movement, this Jesus movement, has said, the laws don't matter. So that exacerbates the tension. And the second one is the persecution of Christians. This is Nero, and Nero in particular will really step up the persecution of Christians. Christians are seen as somewhat disloyal. They don't perform the public cults in the Roman cities, which is these cults are seen as upholding the social order, that by sacrificing to the gods, they protect the city. And the Christians won't do that. It's kind of like civically impolite and a bit blasphemy. And then on top of that, if that's not bad enough, they worship this guy, Jesus. And do you know what happened to him? He was killed for treason, essentially, for sedition, for trying to usurp the Roman emperor. Sometimes at churches, people say Jesus was killed because he taught a gospel of love. The truth is that Roman emperors do not worry if there's some hippie somewhere, if I can use, from their perspective, a derogatory term, some guy somewhere teaching people to love their neighbor. Emperors don't care about that. What they care about is threats to their power. And what happens in this thing is that Jesus, some of his followers think he's the Messiah. The Messiah is supposed to overthrow Roman rulership. And what happens? There's Passover. Do you know what Passover is? Passover is a celebration when the population comes to Jerusalem, so the capital city swells, and they're celebrating the overthrow of a foreign oppressor in Egypt. That's what Passover celebrates, freedom from the Egyptian slavery. So you're the Romans, they're celebrating overthrowing foreign oppressors, and the capital is going to, the population of the capital is going to multiply, many times over because everybody's coming. This is volatile. Then you hear one of the people coming. Some people say he's the Messiah, who's a long-awaited person who throws over foreign oppressors. And then what does Jesus do? He comes in on a donkey, which is a prediction of how the Messiah will arrive. So he is provoking. And then he makes one last move, and that is he goes and causes a ruckus in the temple. And at this point, the Romans say, okay, I know what we do. We nip this in the bud, and that is why he is killed. And it's a Roman execution. Crucifixion was not a Jewish punishment, but a Roman punishment for sedition. Okay, so the Christians are in trouble because the world is run by Romans, and they not only are not worshiping at the public cult, which already makes them persona non grata, but to a lot of people, they follow a challenger to the Roman emperor. And so what happens is Christians are literally being killed in some cases. And so there's a pressure to find someone else to blame for Jesus's death. Who else can you blame it on? Well, there's only one other group you could possibly do, and that is to blame Jesus's death on the Jews. And this is probably the invention of anti-Semitism, true anti-Semitism. Other groups were prejudiced against Jews because all throughout history, we humans have done that. My group is good and your group is bad. But anti-Semitism is different than that routine stuff because it has lasted for 2,000 years. It's taken on a different life and endurance and perseverance than anything else. And the reason for that is the Christians and the Jews have parted, and they're not liking each other very much. Paul was killing them, right? When he was a Pharisee. I'm sure people on both sides said and did a lot of negative things. The unfortunate part is that one of these groups was at that time writing scriptures, and that happened to be the Christians. And so some of this animosity ends up in the scriptures, which I think is the most important thing in inventing the longest hatred, because once it's in scriptures, it'll be read for thousands of years. So in Matthew's story, Jesus is being executed, and Pontius Pilate said, should I free him and stuff like that? And Matthew has the crowd say, the Jewish crowd, his blood be upon us and on our children. I would submit to you folks that no crowd in history has said this. If you think that someone has committed a grave sin and they're now paying the price for it, you don't say his blood's on my head. You say, well, this is on his head. He shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have violated the law. He shouldn't have violated God's commandments. But if you're putting him to death and I think he's innocent, I will say to you, his blood's on your head. And Matthew here, I think, is doing that. He's saying his blood is on their head, but Matthew has the crowd apparently in unison recite, his blood be upon us, and even worse, on our children. And this will become known as the blood libel. 1,000 years later and more, Christians will read this and say, the Jews have called down, they are Christ killers. They have called down the responsibility. They said it's on us, and they said it's on our children's head. And so now I'm in Germany, or Europe in 1200. There is no Germany, and this Jew is responsible for it. He is one of these children. He is a Christ killer. And the place where this happens the worst is actually in John's Gospel. For many people, John's Gospel is their favorite because it's very pretty. There's a lot of pretty language in it. Unfortunately, everybody who studies this agrees that it is the most anti-Semitic of the four Gospels, probably because it is the last one written, and the tensions between the communities are that much more intense. In the other Gospels, Jesus's opponents are always a faction. It's the Sadducees, it's the temple priest, it's the Pharisees who don't like him. But in John's, Jesus's enemies are always the Jews. There are 30 times where he uses the phrase the Jews in a negative way. And the phrase is really unfair because everybody's a Jew. Jesus is a Jew, Peter is a Jew, every disciple is a Jew, everybody who doesn't like him is a Jew, everybody walking by and paying no attention is a Jew. They're all Jews, but John's language blames the Jews. And there's many examples in his text. One of the most famous ones is that Jesus is discussing with, quote, the Jews. And he said something to them and they say, look, we are descendants of Abraham. And Jesus says, I know you are descendants of Abraham, yet you seek to kill me because my word finds no place in you. I speak of what I have seen with my father, and you do what you have heard from your father. They answered, Abraham is our father. And Jesus replied, if you were Abraham's children, you would do what Abraham did. You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desire. And so it sears anti-Jewish passages into the Gospels that will be read literally for thousands of years. Okay, folks, to sum up, does Christianity reject Judaism? Not entirely. There is a move to do this. There is an early Christian leader and thinker, a guy named Marcion, who lives kind of around the early 100s. And he says, yeah, forget Judaism. It was just this other horrible thing. And we have this really good thing. He says the Old Testament God is evil. The New Testament God is good. And it's the one who sends Jesus. There are two different gods. And he creates the first kind of Christian Bible or canon by taking Paul's letters and parts of Luke's gospel. But the major group of Jesus followers will reject Marcion. And as a result, there are a lot of influences from Judaism to Christianity. The worship of Yahweh, the incorporation of the Jewish Bible as part of their own, which means inheriting endless stories that are common to both communities and figures like Moses and Abraham and prophets like Isaiah. And something else, that temple. Now, Christians today have nothing to do with this temple. Fire sacrifice, that seems really weird to them. Animal sacrifice, it seems like it has nothing to do. But when Jesus dies and his Jewish followers have to make sense of what happened here, how are they going to make sense of it? Well, this is how they're going to make sense of it. At this thing, there was a sacrifice of a life. An animal life was sacrificed to atone for sins. It happened every day. It was normal to them. And so looking at that temple, they say, Jesus is a sacrifice. He is a sacrifice to pay for human sins, and they will call him the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. The Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, is supposed to overthrow, he's supposed to lead to great victories and overthrowing of foreign oppressors, and they will spiritualize the language of king and victory to be spiritual victories over death. And why does Jesus have to die for sins? I mean, we used to kill a goat. What is this necessary for? And it will lead to a key Christian doctrine, and that is the pervasiveness of sin. Islam and Judaism has sin, but Christians insist we are all sinners. It's not just something, it's kind of who we are. Why? Because they need to justify, they need a theology that explains, these early Christians, why Jesus had to actually die. And it's because sin is so horrible that it was necessary to pay for human sin. Okay, so what is the relationship with Judaism? Worship Yahweh, the Bible with all its key figures, but on top of that, the temple, which at one level is completely ditched by Christians. It will get destroyed by the Romans in a few decades, and Christians will say, see, there's no temple needed anymore because of Jesus. But that temple provides the central theological teaching of Christianity, which is that Jesus is a sacrifice to atone for sins. So that's the influences. But there's also a profound moving away, the dismissing of Jewish law, the redefining of Messiah to be something completely different from what Jewish tradition said it would be. And even by elevating Jesus as Messiah into the Son of God, changing the very nature of God. They keep Yahweh, but now there's a Trinity, and that there's just no precedence for that in Jewish history. But the movement will become Roman. Even the Christian language will be not Hebrew or Aramaic, but it will become Greek, showing how Gentile it has become within a few decades. And after Paul, probably the next most important person in Christian history is the Emperor Constantine. He cements forever the move. I mean, the move away from Judaism was already there, but he cements the affiliation with Rome. He has a vision. He conquers in the name of Christ. That Christ's sign appeared in the sky. And when he becomes conqueror or ruler, he issues an edict of toleration for Christians. And he really starts to make it kind of a state religion. Before Constantine, maybe 5% or less of the empire was Christian. But by the time of his death, one prominent scholar thinks it had jumped to 50%. It is now the Roman religion. And within a few decades, they will literally have Roman emperors who are Christian, who are closing down all the pagan temples. And so it ends with the council. I'll end with the Council of Nicaea, when the church is first assembled, all of its leaders under the leadership of a Roman emperor. They will don robes. Bishops' robes will start to look like the Roman Senate. The basilicas will look like Roman Senate buildings. And it has truly become a kind of Gentile and Roman church. And so that is the movement from Jerusalem to Rome. Okay, thanks. I hope you've enjoyed that. I'm open for questions. And again, you can check out my center for other talks I'm giving or my blog at Religions Geek if you want to see some of the things I write about. And with that, I will stop sharing.
Okay, absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks
so
John.
much for being with us. And yeah, we will put also the those links to your website for the Encounter World Religions and also your social media, Religions Geek, into the chat so that people will be able to follow you and hear more, because there's probably all of our regulars who are watching this channel, there's probably a few people who are producing stuff that is, like, I think, more completely on topic for the kind of interests that we have, since we have so much overlap. I'm a lot of kinship with you in the presentation that you just made. So.
Yeah, I always appreciate this invitation, John. I so admire what you folks do.
We have a bunch of questions, and so maybe what I'll do is I will read them to you, and then you can
sure.
say what you want to answer.
Sure.
So Luke C. earlier on asked, was Brian saying that Jesus is pulling the golden rule from Hillel?
Yes, he is. There's both a borrowing and an innovation. Because the basic rule he's definitely getting from Hillel. It's just a very well-known Jewish story. Jews would know that story. There is an innovation, though, which is Hillel said, don't do to your neighbor what is hateful to him. And so Jesus does add a twist, right? Because he says, love your neighbor, or how does that go now? All of a sudden I went blank. To love your neighbor as you would love yourself, right? I think that's, my brain's just fried. So Jesus turns it into kind of a more positive statement. But the borrowing is particularly evident, I think, in particular in the second line, because Hillel says, this is the whole Torah.
Right.
So Jesus says, and this is the law, which is another word for prophet, for Torah.
Right.
And the prophets. So yeah, he's definitely borrowing.
Very interesting. Okay, Leonard Warnock asks, what does the vessel supported by the oxen in front of the Jerusalem temple represent for Jews? He's familiar with these in Mormon temples. And in Mormon temples, it becomes a baptismal font. But what is it for the Jerusalem temple for Jews?
Yeah, so it is. It is also a basin for ritual washing. That's right. And the reason it's in that Mormon temple is because it was in that Jerusalem temple. Joseph Smith was very interesting because he, the Mormon founder, because he, and John has forgotten more about Mormons than I'll ever know. But he kind of uniquely amongst Christian groups often reached back to these Jewish things like the temple, right? So Mormons have temples, which other Christians generally don't have. And so it is a direct borrowing. It was used for ritual bathing and washing, and for Mormons, it's used in a similar way.
All right, very good. Trent asks, just pretty simply, were the wise men, are they the magi, are they astrologers? He would just wanted a little more background on that.
Yeah, the wise men are the magi. Magi is a term from the Persian religion of the day. The religion still exists today, but there's maybe like 150,000 left, or maybe fewer, called Zoroastrianism. And yes, so they would have been learned men who practiced astrology. Many ancient peoples understood that what happened in the night sky, what happened in the heavens, would impact what happened on Earth and give clues. And so people read signs for clues on Earth. They still do that, right? People, it's quite prominent in China and in India that when someone's born, if you're looking to arrange a marriage, you would check with an astrologer first and stuff like that. So they're reading the signs. There's a new star, and so they're following that star. And all of that in Matthew's gospel says, there are wise men who recognize something big's happened. There's an actual celestial event that shows it's big. And then they come with gifts fit for a kind of king, which shows Matthew's Jewish readers, or who Matthew hopes he has Jewish readers, that, hey, this guy's actually a really big deal. Very, very good.
We also, we have a lecture on who were the Magi too for him to go back to. Trent asks, I think this means to the historical Jesus. Did the historical Jesus and the historical apostles actually study Torah?
That's a good question. So um, there are sometimes there are passages that seem to indicate that the apostles are illiterate. There is a passage where Jesus, it says that he opens the scroll and reads it.
Yep.
So I think that's never, there are accounts that show him as literate, and then sometimes some of them as not literate. All of them would have orally heard a lot of Torah, right? That they would have heard it a lot. And it would not be surprising that some of them, or maybe many of them, could also read. So they're definitely, Torah is something they're familiar with, even just orally.
Very good. Leonard also asked, okay, this is a complicated question. He's not sure. Anyway, he's saying, what is the historically accepted age when people are meant to know good from evil? So I think maybe he's meaning in Jewish law is like it works maybe for like kids, how old do they have to be when they're maybe made to be accountable or something like that?
Right. Okay. So what was the questioner's name again?
Leonard Warnock.
Leonard. So if you're referring to that passage in where Isaiah says to King Ahaz, look, there's a woman with child, and there's a young woman with child, and before that kid knows right from wrong, these kings will be gone.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I think he means like, I don't know, by the time the kid's 6 or 7.
Yeah.
Now, there's a different way of answering this question, which at some level, the real level of full accountability in Judaism is more when you kind of do your bar mitzvah, which is around age 12. But I don't think in this context, that's what's being referred to. I think it just means, before this kid knows a little bit of good and bad, these kings will be gone.
That makes sense. Trent also asked, they were having questions about maybe they're talking about Jewish books, and I'm wondering if it's maybe the what Paul's calling there the circumcising faction or whatever, the Jamesian church.
Yeah.
Was it the pagan Romans how are those books lost if they have books, or is it, were they actually destroyed, or they simply haven't been copied or kept or something like that, I guess is the question.
Sorry, which books have been destroyed? I missed something.
Well,
there.
I'm saying Jewish books, but I was anticipating that maybe what he's meaning is the books from the faction of the early Christians when we were talking about Paul versus the
okay.
the Jamesian faction, or
So that's a good question. So there is an early community of Jews. They later acquired the title the Ebionites, and it means the poor ones, because they're poor. They're these small group of Jewish Christians who, even Peter and James, when they were alive, were asking for money. And they're treated derogatorily, by the year 90 and 120 and 150. They're called Judaizers, that they're trying to stick to Judaism. They may have had some writings. Some things are known about them because people wrote about them. So they weren't big fans of Paul, as you can imagine. They were fans more of James. And they believed Jesus is a Messiah, but that you should continue to follow Jewish law, because isn't that what the Jewish Messiah, isn't that consistent with our understandings of the Jewish Messiah? Isn't that what Jesus himself did? But they just lost. They weren't able to convince anybody in their communities, and the communities that grew were outside. And so they may have written some things, but if so, they are completely lost to us.
In the next couple of months, we actually are going to try to have a lecture on the fragments, of the Gospel of the Ebionites, the Gospel of the Hebrews, these lost texts from this faction. So look forward to that for people who are interested in that. Trent also confirmed that that's what he meant. So we interpreted his question right. So we're glad we got it right, Trent. Daryl Scott asks, apparently the Romans respected Judaism because it was so ancient. And so in the same way that Christianity is spreading around the empire because of missionaries, were Jews proselyting? Were they trying to spread, was Judaism a converting religion in the Roman Empire?
Yeah, not nearly in the same way. Like there were in synagogues, sometimes there were people who came and listened. They were called God-fearers, who found attraction in the Jewish ethical teachings and stuff, but maybe didn't like all the laws, and so they wouldn't actually fully convert, but they'd keep coming. So it's not a proselytory tradition by any means in the same way, but then the Christians are. And you're right, like the Jews also didn't sort of genuflect at these public cultic altars, but at least they had antiquity, and the Romans respected antiquity. But the Christians are a double kind of negative because they don't honor the public gods, and there's some newfangled thing, and well, you can't trust any newfangled thing. So we're still like that, right? When there's a new religion, everybody calls it a cult at first.
Right.
Yeah.
George asks, and kind of, well, he makes a comment here that some scholars, he's citing Ehrman, for example, argue that a big key step in the branches of some of the earlier branches of Christianity, that when they see Christ as a God, is what really led Christianity to become an actual new and successful religion. And he wants to, I guess, whether you think that that's one of the major breaking point or not, or in terms of that division.
I mean, it certainly is. It certainly is a breaking point with Judaism. Is it what causes it to be a new and successful religion? Like Ehrman would also tell you that thinking somebody is divine wasn't that rare back then, right?
Yeah.
That there are other figures for whom this is claimed, but it's hard to actually. I've read some accounts of people trying to figure out why it was so successful. Some people think it was because it was communal. There's a lot of sharing of resources, and it might have appealed in particular to women and stuff like that. But I'm uncertain of those competing factions. You're certainly right, though, that it is a definite break with Judaism. Once you go down that path, you have left the Jewish fold.
Yeah, very good. So Alexandra Santos Anderson has a question, I think, about here, a community who wrote the text, the Psalms of Solomon, which includes, I guess he's using it to cite here, some writings in there about their attitudes toward the Messiah. He was saying how maybe with some factions, like in Judaism here, feel about Roman rule, given the fact that they were actually really also very dissatisfied with the Hasmoneans, and so is it possible that kind of some of the sects that were kind of anti-Maccabee, anti-Hasmonean, is that also informed early Christianity? If you know anything, if you have any comment on that, it's interesting.
I don't know if it informs early Christianity. There was an ongoing debate for a few centuries. Like some people have said that the Maccabean revolt is actually a civil war. Mm-hmm. That rather than Jews overthrowing foreign oppressors, it's a kind of civil war between Jews who are comfortable living Greek ways and integrating Greek life and assimilating, and others who feel like this is a violation of our history and who we really are. So that kind of argument is always there. Does it inform Christian thought? I don't see a direct link that I can think of. I think the Jesus thing, the Christian movement really hinges on the life of Jesus, who I don't think he's central. I don't think his message falls along that fault line so much.
Yeah, very good. Ron Wagner asks, why do Catholics say Peter is the first pope and not Paul? Because it seems like they follow Paul more than Peter.
Yeah. So for Catholics, there's a passage in the scriptures where Peter is sort of designated by Jesus as to be the first leader. You are Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church. And so that's how he's seen. He's seen as the first bishop of Rome, which is technically what the Pope is. He's just the bishop of Rome. But he doesn't end up shaping the scriptures as much. The scriptures are shaped by Paul, but Paul can't be the first leader because he's originally literally killing the Jesus followers. Whereas Peter's there, at the day after the resurrection, Peter's there. So Paul can't be the first guy. But it is true, scripturally, Paul's influence is unmatched. But institutionally, Peter has this status as kind of the cornerstone, which is literally kind of drawing from that passage.
Ian Donnelly asks, with the initial Jesus movement being anti-Roman, did the Gentile turn that sentiment to becoming a more general anti-government, anti-emperor stance that was inclusive of Roman culture? Wait, did the Gentile turn include? Oh, the Gentile turn. So, by being Gentile, the early Christians who were being recruited among the Gentiles, are they kind of anti-government, anti-emperor in early Christianity, or? Oh, there's a follow-up. I'm sorry. Additionally, how much pre-existing anti-government sentiment was there in the Roman world for the Christians to appropriate, or was it that Christianity made people more anti-government? That's kind of their question. Yeah.
Right. The Roman emperor is, it's an oppressive, this isn't a democracy and stuff like that. So there's always a fair amount of people being unhappy with the kind of oppressiveness of the state. So that's always there to a degree. But I would say that Christianity I think early Christians did not overly try to go down that path for the very reason that the accusation was that they were a threat to the state, right? So like Jesus's line about, render to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's, that line looks like the sort of thing, maybe Jesus said that, but if he didn't, and someone was writing later, there would be an incentive to have Jesus say something like that basically says to the Romans, see, we're pretty good. We'll give to Caesar his taxes, which is really all Caesar cares about. So I think it was, appealing to some folks on the margins as a community that will take care of you. And with that, there would be a lot of people who didn't see the state well, but it was not a seditious movement. If anything, it was trying to say, you don't have to hate us and you don't have to kill us.
Nadav Kravitz asks, if a Christian wants to be faithful to the historically authentic teachings of Jesus, would they have to become Jewish?
Oh, what a good question. Yeah, that's a super question. And here's a question, like, would the historical Jesus expect a Gentile to follow Jewish law? And honestly, I think on that, I have to refrain from comment on that part because we just have nothing to go on. I would be completely speculating. I just don't think that's a question Jesus addresses. I do think, there are parts of his teachings that are very clear, right? I don't think there's any question that Jesus had a real disdain for hypocrisy, that he was very big on forgiveness. All those parables of the lost sheep or the prodigal son, and that he certainly had, his teachings about the poor and the marginalized, right? He's constantly talking about the poor and the marginalized. So those, I think, are ways that you can follow Jesus's teachings that are more kind of universal. Would he expect? I think if your question had been, would he have expected one of his Jewish followers to stay loyal to Jewish law? I think absolutely. Would he have expected a Gentile to follow Jewish law? That I don't know. That I feel like there's just such thin evidence. I'd be speculating completely.
Michelangelo asks, could you talk a little bit about the Mandaeans? Are they similar to early Christians? Are they completely different? What's their story?
Yeah, no, they're not similar to Christians. They follow John the Baptist. They trace back 2,000 years. There were followers of John the Baptist, and the community was mostly in what we today call the Middle East until some recent wars and immigration. But up until that time, it was a small community that maintained there. They're a fairly difficult group to know too much about. A lot of stuff is kind of kept inside the community, and there's some secret teachings. But in recent decades and stuff, there has been a migration out, and so now you can bump into them. So very tiny community that has, for a long time, it was only intermarriage too within the community. Like there's been a lot of pressure to do that to keep the community alive. So a very small, sort of self-contained community that has persevered for a super long time.
We need to be able to have something more on them because they're very interesting, and especially right now, like you say, very much in the news based on all of the troubles that they've been having most recently in these times, war times.
Yeah.
Leandro asks, is this a unique development, or do we find similar appropriations of a movement in other contexts? I think he was meaning to say here is that Christianity, with its Jewish roots and maintaining a lot of Jewishness within it. For example, he has, as an example, Buddhism has become a Chinese and a South Asian religion as it declined in India, which is where it came from.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So there's nothing quite like it. Like, so Buddhism does in the same way that it grows in India, emerges in India, but grows somewhere else. What's different with Buddhism is that the Buddha-Jesus comparison is a very interesting one, because the Buddha clearly does actually reject Hindu teachings, right? He rejects the Vedas, he rejects the rituals explicitly. Stop doing these things, stop doing the animal sacrifices, because they had them in India at the time. And so he stops it himself, and his followers stop it. There's no Paul in Buddhism. No one has to come along later and say, maybe we should ditch all this stuff and become this, because the Buddha himself had done it. So geographically, it's the similar thing. It grew up in this land, but actually now it's all over there. But theologically, doctrinally, maybe that's what I'm looking for, it's not the same, because the break is the Buddha himself, and so there's no later sort of shift. Whereas with Christianity, the shift is after the founder. Right. It's so that part is different. And you were saying, is there anyone else like that? Nothing quite. The only thing I mentioned that the Christians have Jewish scriptures. The closest sort of thing, but it's still quite different, is the Sikh community. The Sikh scriptures have writings from the Sikh gurus, who are the key figures in that tradition. They also have writings from Muslim Sufi saints, or poets who are very revered in that tradition, like the poet Kabir. And they also have writings from famous Hindus as well. So they didn't incorporate a whole, they didn't incorporate the Quran, they didn't incorporate a whole book of Hindu scriptures, but their actual scripture books are the writings of Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs. So that's probably the closest thing, but as you can see, there's still some big differences.
Well, Brian, I think we got to the end of our questions, and I really appreciate you taking time to be with us and also to engage the audience like this. I also wonder if do you have any announcements you want to make, or anything upcoming that you might want to send people to?
Yeah, sure. I can tell you two things. One, if you're looking for something upcoming, is just next week, and I can't remember what day of the week, I think the 1st or the 2nd. I have a talk on through an organization called Road Scholar. You can see it on my website, and it's on the Day of the Dead and on Santa Muerte. I don't know if some of you know what Santa Muerte is, but it's Holy Death. It's the folk saint, the skeleton saint in Mexico. So I'm going to give that talk through them. There is a registration fee. I think it's $20. But if you want, I'm going to do that next week. It's a new talk, and I'm kind of excited about it. And the other thing is, on our website, if you go to the Discovery Week in the summer, our best event that I mentioned at the beginning is we have this 7-day program where we explore 11 religions in 1 week in Toronto, usually with about 16, 18 site visits. And because I have folks all week, we do introductory classes, and we go and we time our visits for ritual. We see the Sikhs carry their grants to bed. We go to Shabbat, the synagogue. We meet a Rasta elder, and we meet a Zoroastrian. So that's the best thing we do. Our registration is usually open, but we've lost the facility we use. So it's not quite open yet, but you can go look at the event there, and hopefully it'll be open within the month. And it's the best thing we do by far. It is the premier sort of anchor event of our whole center.
Well, I want to put in a huge plug for that myself too. So I've done the Discovery Week maybe 4 times with you, and it's absolutely life-changing. I mean, every time I've done it more than once, but anyway, just even the first time, and meeting the other people in the cohort as you were having these experiences, you might think, oh, I've watched all these lectures, I know lots about all these religions. You don't realize what it is until you not only get that additional context, but are also in that experiencing that actual encounter like that. And it's just amazing to do. So yeah, check it out, the worldreligions.ca, and all of the other links we will have in the comments here, and we'll say goodbye. Thanks so much, Brian.
Okay, thanks. Thanks again, John. Thanks, Leandro. And thanks to everyone for listening. I really appreciate your time.